Welcome, initiates. Today's word from the Akasha is conscience. Now, this is a most difficult word, but let's break it down. Con means to pull together, but I like the word thoroughly, con, so let's say thoroughly, and then science comes from the word skio, S-C-I-O, skio, which means to know. And in this case, really think about what it means to know, because when you're talking about knowing, that should lead you immediately to what conscience is trying to tell you. To thoroughly know. Well, if you thoroughly know, the philosophers would say that that is an intuition. And that's where we're headed today. Where does conscience come from? It comes from your intuition. What is intuition? Oh, intuition is the most mysterious part of the human being because it's in the human will power. And it is so mysterious that in some ways you can say that our subconscious, our collective conscious, our unconscious, all these different consciousnesses. Notice also this, most people confuse this with the word conscience, but these different consciousnesses, these different levels, how much of that is us? How much of that is personal? How much of that is another voice inside of us? Rudolf Steiner talks about conscience being a second voice inside of us. As a matter of fact, he calls it the superior man or the superior human inside of us. And so we were talking about, literally, as we talked before, when we were talking about Lojong and the initiation processes of Tibetan Buddhism called Dzogchen, that first you see light, then you hear sound, then you hear words. Well, that's what conscience is. Conscience is literally, according to Rudolf Steiner, it would be called the life ether. It's the word. It's when the word sounds. And before that, you'll hear sounding. In other words, music, harmony of the spheres. And before that, you'll see light. So you can see that this process that we've been talking about quite a bit when we were discussing initiation in these conversations about the Akashic Chronicles, the Akashic Records, the place where all memory is stored and can still be accessed at this very moment. So when we want to talk about conscience and we go to the Akashic Records, what are we going to find out? Oh, it's quite amazing. Conscience has developed. And amazingly enough to me, or surprisingly enough, I should say, that modern scholars would say the same thing that Rudolf Steiner said, which is that conscience could be literally found to have its origin in writing and in philosophy in the Greek dramatists, especially with Aeschylus, and between Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, you can actually see a transformation from what are called the Three Furies, or in Greek the Erinyes. They are three vicious beings who chase you if you've done something wrong until you've resolved it. And they're called the Furies in the Roman version. And so this, according to Rudolf Steiner, we can't really even get to conscience until we have something else. And he made this statement, and I've been making it again and again because it's the only simplified form of anthroposophy, I think. He says the development of human being is about going from consciousness to conscience. Now, what in the world does that mean? And what is conscience? And so, go ahead, try to study it. And what you're going to find is that there's very little that anyone has to say about it. Why? Because it's so profound that no one can quite explain it. Well, Rudolf Steiner explains it, but you have to go through all of his work and combine it and take a look at many things that you might not think have anything to do with conscience, and then you will start to get a picture. But we can see that in the story of Orestes, written by Aeschylus, after he commits a crime, he's chased by the Furies. But then in Sophocles, the Furies are no longer mentioned when someone commits a crime. And by the time it comes to Euripides, they're talking about something inside of the human being that's a voice that just speaks to them. And then when you come to Socrates, of course, you have what we put in the article that will accompany this Akasha talk, and that is an article on conscience. You'll find a lot of reference to Socrates and his relationship to his daemon. Now, that isn't demon, that's daemon. It's kind of like deva. It's kind of like genie. It's kind of like what we would call, or Rudolf Steiner would explain, as your double. And by the way, when you start to investigate your double, you'll find there's three parts, just like there's three Furies. And the double will tell you what you've done wrong. And just as Socrates said, his daemon would tell him if he made a mistake, if he went the wrong way, if he took the wrong path. But it will not necessarily tell him which is the right path if he's just reflecting on it, thinking about it. So why is it that conscience only comes to existence when you take an action or you're thinking about taking an action? And then all of a sudden, this entire world comes up that it's another voice and it speaks to you and it tells you if you're going to do something wrong. And it says, and I'm basically going to bother your heart. I'm going to bother your conscience. I'm going to bother your moral feeling of inadequacy until you rectify it. Now, in a way, it's almost a joke to me because in the past, they were concerned about conscience. Let's talk about the present. People have wiped their conscience out. They don't listen to it at all. And if their conscience spoke to them, for some people who are literally working out of non-virtuous sources, evil sources, sources of negativity that won't help them in their growth at all, it'll just set them back, they want to wipe out conscience. They want to make sure that that was called the still small voice or the voice of God no longer sounds. They can't hear it. Why? Because then they can do whatever they want. Because one of the subtle things about conscience is that as you are acting, something, as Rudolf Steiner uses the word, or at least translated, it prickles your heart. It bothers the outside surface of your heart, and you can't let it in your heart until you've analyzed it, right? Or until you've not really analyzed it, but you've responded to it. And this response, as is pointed out by Emerson and many others, the response of the conscience in us, it doesn't matter if you're young or old, it doesn't matter if you try to develop morality or not, conscience speaks, and it is almost infallible. It speaks as if it is divine, and that it's separate from us, but that it is in fact giving us guidance. And in a way, that is what the philosophers who try to handle addressing conscience, and by the way, I've been searching philosophy for a long, long time, and very few will address what conscience is. Rudolf Steiner is the only person who actually is going to give us a picture, literally two pictures of the heart and of the cerebellum in relationship to conscience. And if you put those two together, which no one has, but we have today, we're going to show you how simple this is and how profound it is. But until you realize how it fits into the correspondences of spiritual science and the whole cosmology in your own ninefold constitution, then it's very difficult to understand, because it's in, as we would call it, somewhat the unconscious or the subconscious parts of mankind inside of themselves. And where does that come from? Now, let's take a look at first any topic that you wish to address. You should ask if Aquinas has said anything about it. Ask if Aristotle said anything about it, and then if Aquinas said anything about it, and then you'll get the view of what logic and theology can tell you. Because when it comes to conscience, it's only 1 minute into the first discussion of it, and it comes up as something divine, something related to faith, something related to the spirit, and many materialistic philosophers of our times and egotistic people, selfish people, they don't want to talk about conscience. They don't want to listen to their conscience. And they don't care where it came from. As a matter of fact, if they knew where it came from, then they would probably dislike it even more and turn their evil ways against it, because it literally comes from the first rank of the hierarchy. And this is a shock to almost all anthroposophists that I speak with about this. And that's the reason I felt absolutely that it was an imperative drive to make a statement about this, because as of recent, we've been discussing initiation, and we've been discussing the 3 stages of initiation: imagination, inspiration, intuition, all of which are moral steps on the spiritual path: moral imagination, moral inspiration, moral intuition. Now we're talking about conscience. And as you've noticed in anything that I've ever produced that was written, right after I mention those 3, I always mention conscience, even if it's just a slight remark, because that's the direction we're going. As a matter of fact, if at the moment that you commit an act, let's say, for instance, well, let's give an example that Rudolf Steiner gives. He says that if you saw something that happened that was horribly wrong, absolutely immoral, so unjust that, and it happened right in front of your eyes, your spiritual nature can be determined by how much divine wrath rose up in you against what it is that you saw as a moral action. In other words, what is divine wrath? It's your conscience. What would speak up if you saw someone being harmed by someone else, and you knew it was an evil deed? You would, of course, want to leap into action. The modern world would tell you, don't get involved. It's a legal issue, blah, 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 and don't worry about the other, just worry about yourself. But if you had moral compunction, if you had a moral of treasury of wisdom through your experience, then you would be able to say, I must act. And people who describe this, as a matter of fact, in many novels and many stories and many historical explanations of why things happened in history, it all comes down to one thing. One person deciding that their conscience will not bend and that they will stick to what their conscience tells them to do. And that's the reason we have so many different religions. It's the reason we have so many different philosophies, because people are trying to stay true to this voice that they hear in themselves, but they don't know where it comes from. So which are you going to follow? And do you believe, as Thomas Aquinas believed, that there was a part of conscience that was infallible? Well, we know in most cases, because it sounds inside of us, whether we like it or not, that when conscience speaks, it seems to be the right and the good and the just and the compassionate thing to do. And it seems moral, the moral thing to do. Well, if that's the case, then one could say, then a person's conscience is only going to sound as loud as they have built up their morality inside of themselves. In other words, love for the other, compassion for the world. And so they would say it depends on your culture. Sigmund Freud would say that's the superego, the id being the animalistic side, the ego being the side that can be rational and logical, but the superego is the side that says, and I looked this up, but the only thing that anyone can decide is that when you do this, or you do this, or you do this, they're talking about friction, fire, and they're saying what you're doing is creating fire. Okay? Now, if it's shame, shame on you, which is what was told to me when I was young, not that I ever did anything wrong and deserve to be shamed, but today's world, people don't want to face shame because they don't want to change. Steiner and others pointed out that until you have shame, you haven't realized that you did anything wrong. And that's the reason the age of knowing, the age of responsibility in the Catholic Church is the age of 12. You can't sin before then because you don't know the difference. So what does the conscience need to develop? And is it just the laws, the mores, the culture that you're raised in that develops this moral voice inside of you? Well, then why is it that Socrates said he took his daemon and learned to work with it until he could have a communication with it, a dialogue with it? And after a while, it became his teacher. Well, Rudolf Steiner says that in the selections I've given you from Rudolf Steiner, he says that basically the conscience is your spirit self. It would be the redeemed part of your astral body that goes up into the spiritual world. And that is an amazing thing. That's the first stage of initiation. So conscience is necessary for spiritual development, for spiritual initiation, for awakening, to awaken to the higher three selves that you have. And of course, as we know, once you reach even the spirit self, you're going to deal with Christ. But Rudolf Steiner said that as the entire human conscience, in other words, the conscience of every human being, okay, so human conscience adds to Christ's body, the life spirit. Now, what does that mean? That means that every good deed that you do is a moral deed that goes into the future. Well, every good deed would probably have love in it, and love is eternal, and it goes to build the next world that we're going to live in. And in this world, there's a ton of wisdom everywhere, whether it's in nature, in your body, in yourself as you're developing it. And so what we need to remember is that every single time that that voice is sounding, it's basically Christ calling you to himself in the life spirit. Now, if you don't believe in Christ, call it your higher self, call it the solar logos, call it whatever you want. Sometimes Steiner's even said, call it Krishna, call that being Krishna. So there's many names for this being. And then, but what he really says is something that is so shocking to most people, but once they think about it, and when it's explained with these images, they say, oh, of course, that's very simple to believe and understand. What happened in the tree, with the tree of good, the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden? What happened was they ate it and they woke up and they knew the difference between right and wrong. In other words, they became co-creators instead of just being a created being, a creature. They became a co-creator. And at that moment, what happened? This had to do everything with the uprightness of the human being. That's what the tree represents. And the snake going around it, of course, is the spinal cord, or even what today we may mention as the vagus nerve. And it goes up, and then what happens up there, that's where the fruit happens. Well, that's what happens up in the pineal gland. It's the fruit of all your work in your heart that goes to the pineal gland. So Rudolf Steiner said that if you want to look at the best representation in the human body, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you would look at the cerebellum. Well, why would that be? Because in the past, all of the animals perfected everything to do with what became the human being's ability to stand upright, to walk, to speak, not quite to think, but certainly to make sure that all the organs were prepared for that. And there's one nerve called the vagus nerve that actually combines all of those things, every one of them. And so we can talk about that as it coming out of the heart and going up into the cerebellum, because it comes out, the vagus nerve, at the base of the cerebellum. And if you cut the cerebellum in a cross section, it looks like a tree with 12 branches. And Steiner said it was the most perfect organ in the human body. Of course, he says the head is the most perfected part of the body, but inside of the head, the cerebellum is perfected because everything that every animal and insect ever learned, everything they ever perfected, was given to the human being, and it is in the cerebellum. In other words, the tree of knowledge of good and evil is the tree that understands your willpower. And what did we say about willpower, human will? It's the most mysterious thing there is, and few people can even address it. They'll address it as instinct or impulse or desire or the id, according to Freud, but they don't understand the nature of the fact that when we stood upright, according to Rudolf Steiner, because we're not horizontal like the animals, but we stood upright vertically, a flame started to go from the heart towards the brain. And that is, in fact, the path that the conscience rides on. And literally, you can go down into the exact way that it works with the vagus nerve. But let's go back to the image of the Garden of Eden when they picked the fruit and they found out what was different, what was good, what was evil. They had discrimination. They developed consciousness, the I am. What happened? They got kicked out. And what was put up there? A flaming sword. And who held it? A cherubim. A cherubim held the flaming sword. And what did the cherubim say? You have to leave because I have to protect you from the tree of life, because you might ruin that too. That's, of course, modern parlance. The cherubim did not say that. The cherubim said he was guarding the tree of life. And, of course, we know legends of how one of the children of Adam came back into the Garden of Eden, but that's a story for another day. The point is that the cerebellum today tells us if there's imbalance, tells us what's right, what's left, what's forward, what's backwards, what's up, what's down, what's light, what's dark. All the other 12 cranial nerves actually get coordinated by the vagus nerve. Now, this vagus nerve is quite amazing, and we'll go to that in just a second. But let's look again at the flaming sword of the cherubim. What does Rudolf Steiner say? He says that conscience is created by cherubim's wisdom in the blood. Okay? So the flaming ego consciousness, the I am that is in the blood, that the blood corpuscles as Christ-like beings give over themselves to carry oxygen, which then renews and nourishes the whole body. This whole process is in the blood, and conscience is there also. Well, Rudolf Steiner says the ego, the I am, is found in the blood, and is found in the warmth of the blood. So when we're talking about a flaming sword, and we're talking about the warmth of the wisdom of the cherubim in the blood, isn't it a coincidence that again flame comes up? And also I put this up here because it's referred to as celestial fire by many, or flame, the flame of God. So conscience is often seen as this flame. Rudolf Steiner says, yes, it is a flame, and that it appears in the human being in between emotions and willpower. Now that is very, very an amazing indication. So when you see something in the outer world, and it's right or it's coming at you, you have to decide whether you're going to let it into your heart. So the surface of the heart prickles or it doesn't. If it prickles, it casts it back and it refuses to take the perception until perhaps you take an action in relationship to what you're seeing. But if it lets it into the heart is a supersensible organ. And as you can see here, conscience is called a supersensible organ. The heart is sometimes called the judge. Well, so is conscience. Where do we find the throne of God? On your heart. In your heart, in the heart of hearts. Where do we hear the voice of God? In the heart. Where do we hear the still small voice? In the heart. It's called the voice of the heart. But as this is happening, and let's say you're having an experience with someone that you know, and something traumatic happened, and you're trying to understand what you should do, and your conscience starts to speak to you and says you should do this or that. If you are spiritually developed, and I know you are, you wouldn't be listening to this, initiates, because you're seeking the wisdom that's in the Akasha, the eternal wisdom that's there. At that moment, Rudolf Steiner says there's a presentiment of karma. There's a pre-picture. There's a pre-picturing of the karmic consequences of your deed. And who is it that gives you that? That's really not you. It's a new part of you that's developing, but that's your conscience. That's literally the cherubim, who are also the beings of harmony. So, one might say in modern parlance, if you see something as a perception that is out of resonance, your heart doesn't accept it. It's not going to resonate with it. It's going to reject it because it's disharmonious. It's discordant. Well, doesn't that make perfectly good sense? You've often heard me say that the only thing you need is a pure heart. And your heart is like a bell that sounds. And any perception coming in, you should be able to hear or see the light and hear the sound and then listen for the word of what is really being told to you about that perception if it is requiring you to take action. Because action will lead to karma, good or ill. And conscience, higher than consciousness. So all the people who say, consciousness is the highest thing. No, it's not. Because we're not conscious. We do not have consciousness of the higher morality in our conscience. And that has been shown through history innumerable times, because people followed their conscience when it was against everything their thoughts and their mind and logic was telling them, everything their feelings were telling them. The easy way outs were oftentimes much, much, much easier to do than following your conscience. So what we have here is a presentiment of karma. In other words, you get to become a co-creator with your own karma. But that happens also every night when you review your day backwards. Rudolf Steiner uses the German word Rückschau, backwards, and you try to live it through the eyes of those that you had interactions with. Well, that would be the same thing. You're trying to develop the sense of presentiment of karma. It's also called, some of these are from Rudolf Steiner, some of these are from other spiritual scientists, but these are great words, and then we'll get into what Aquinas says in relationship to particularly the modern world. And so we see these other names, cosmic spirit speaking. Some people get freaked out, and so they turn off their conscience speaking to them. How many crazy people in the psych ward, what we call crazy people, are actually hearing their own conscience? And when they think that Jesus Christ is speaking to them, could that not be their life spirit speaking to them? Could that not be literally the wisdom of Christ speaking to them? And so when you can't handle this, it's because you're trying to go too fast into the future. In the future, all of this will be completely natural. Your conscience will walk right beside you. And it will be as if Christ is your friend, and the judge, the Lord of Karma, walks right beside you. And as you're thinking about doing something, you will see the outcome. You will know, not see, you will know the outcome. Big difference. Because knowing is intuition. Knowing, matter of fact, Steiner points out that true free thinking arises as an intuition of love. So love and intuition, willpower, this upright flame that can actually know the good and then go and hopefully then gain Eden again and gain the tree of life. That's what we're trying to develop. That would be the Christ will, or the Christ in us, or what you would say, the Pauline word, not I, but Christ in me. Now, Rudolf Steiner also says that as we're talking about conscience, we have to remember that it's like talking about your guardian angel. Is it your guardian angel speaking to you? Is it your higher self? Is it your spirit self? He literally says, spirit self, your I am. He says, literally in terms of spiritual science, conscience and spirit self are one and the same. Those are his words. They're one and the same. So again, as I keep pointing out, and someday maybe someone else will say they also believe this. But it's very clear. Matter of fact, Steiner says it again and again. He refers to it as the supermen coming to us from Venus, Mercury, and Vulcan, or superhumans. Those are us. Those aren't our older brothers and sisters from the Pleiades. Those are our higher self, the spirit self, life spirit, spirit man coming to us. And you can find that also by redeeming then, of course, the bodies, the ego, astral, etheric, and physical. As you redeem them, they become higher spiritual forces. So Rudolf Steiner says basically it's one and the same. So if you know what your conscience is, you can begin to communicate with it. And if you know that the whole time that they called it the Furies, it was really elements of the cherubim that were trying to develop a moral willpower in the human being who had done something wrong, by chasing after them and prickling their conscience and telling their heart that the deed they did was wrong. Now, that's somewhat theoretical, somewhat spiritual, very spiritual. But now we're going to get down into philosophy. Aquinas says, because he noticed right away that there seemed to be a moral side of the human being that was infallible. And then there was another side, depending upon how cultured you were, how, not really, it doesn't come from culture experience, it's just who you are. So there were some who had this not so good fallible conscience, and others who had an infallible conscience, and they believed that every time they heard that voice speak to them, well, that was because they were moral, they were virtuous, they were pure, they were pious. So when the voice of conscience spoke through them, that was them speaking. Of course, it's not going to speak evil. But for an evil person, what little conscience that might speak, and as we know, it had to develop, and it came fully into its awareness at the mystery of Golgotha. When Christ died, he gave over conscience as a part of the human willpower that could now begin to be understood. And so, it is our task to awaken this, and it is our task to go from a fallible conscience to an infallible synderisa. Now, Aquinas invented a word, and his word was to make the distinction basically between theological, spiritual conscience, which is infallible, and what human beings then do with it. They may hear the infallible voice, but they may not do with it what they're supposed to do. They may not do the right thing. It's always a choice. Humans have free will. So he separated them into two. Conscience was one thing, synderisa was another. He said synderisa was infallible. It was the standard of wisdom. So all the standards of all human beings' wisdom. In other words, like the being of wisdom. Well, of course, that's going to be either the curiosities or the wisdom that Steiner talks about coming from the cherubim in the human blood. So the standard of wisdom, moral instincts. In other words, that's why the child knows what's right and wrong, even before age 12, and without development of conscience, even beyond their own culture. There are people who rise up against the culture. Where did they get that impulse? So there are instincts that are beyond human impulses. And then there are moral precepts. And this is the great thing. The Sendarisa is where your moral precepts are held. In other words, some would say that you perceive something and it comes at you, comes at your heart. Your heart becomes a supersensible organ, and it determines whether or not it's good and harmonious and resonant. And then it determines whether they're going to take that into the heart. And if it does, and it all works out, then they make that their precept. But there might be people with very few precepts. So therefore, there must be that distinction. So this distinction is refined, but one could say this is the future human being, and this is us now. So conscience now is fallible, and it's the standard for action. It's not the standard for wisdom, because that standard for wisdom, there may be a lot more wisdom in you than you can articulate, and that wisdom isn't yours. So it's a standard for action. What are you going to do with this wisdom? Because the voice of conscience may speak wisdom to you that you knew nothing about. But you can still create from that wisdom a standard of action. You can say, well, I believe that it's a good thing to do these things, and create precepts from that also. Moral impulse. Now, you may have the impulse to go help that beggar. You may have the impulse to stop that injustice that creates righteous wrath in you. You may have this impulse coming out of yourself, and when that happens, you may or may not follow it. And that's why it's an impulse. But the instinct is still there for you. And then perception, and this is the one that matters so much, and this is when we'll go to the heart. Moral precepts. If you have moral precepts and you're looking out in the world, sometimes you override your own perception. And you just think the world is this way, and you go out as a fundamentalist and you do all these things you think are moral, and they're not moral at all. I know that may shock some people, and others, they know full well what I'm talking about. So you have to get perception under control until it becomes moral. Your perception has to literally come out of a moral place. When you look into the world, you should be saying, thank you to the beings who created all of this for us. And if you understand the cosmology behind it, then it's a marvel and it's a wonder. And it's a fantastic thing. And if that's the case, then right out of the world, matter of fact, I should mention this because I just brought it up, that out of your wonder in the world, out of your compassion for what you see in the world, conscience will actually develop on your own. Or out of your physical body, from one of these higher forces of conscience coming out of your unconscious will, it can tell you what to do. You can go either way. You can either perceive your conscience as a voice speaking to you, and then figure out what's your I am and what's your ego and what's your, what he calls the superior voice. And then you can, with that, control your astral, etheric, and physical bodies. Steiner said there were 3 unlimited things with the human being. And he noticed, he can let you notice this by saying, go into your dreams. In your dreams, can you ever say that you're looking at your consciousness? Or did you ever in your dreams say, let's think about consciousness. Let me think about my thinking. Or let me think, no, it never happens. Never happens. But your consciousness is unlimited, but it doesn't work in dreams. How about wonder? When you're in dreams, do you have wonder? No, you see amazing things and you never once have wonder. Nothing surprises you. Anything can happen. You can see what you thought were angels. You can see the most magnificent things. It's not going to change. But in the real world, wonder is unlimited. And without that, your astral body can't properly engage. And without consciousness, your ego can't properly engage. And compassion, think in a dream, when you saw something horrible and you felt compassion in the dream, inside of yourself, to then go outside of yourself to help another person. No, it's the opposite in dreams. Everything on the outside is you, and the compassion would be the outside having compassion or not having compassion on you. It's the exact opposite. So, conscience also, can you go into your dreams and hear the voice of God in your dreams to tell you what to do? You can have precognition, and yes, you can, once you learn that the voice coming out of the life ether is in fact a voice that you can contact in your dreams, but that is part of initiation. So he points out that this is the warmth ether, light ether, sound ether, life ether, and that's the reason consciousness sounds like words. Compassion sounds like harmony of the spheres when you're bringing everything into harmonious resonance. Wonder is the astral light, the light ether. Well, that's the case with imagination. It's the case even with fantasy. It's the case with all the mental images you have. Really, what are we but mental images that are the shadow of the light of the sun? Think of that. The light in you, your mental images that basically control everything that you do, from perception to action, all comes from the sun. So the light of the sun is bouncing around in you until it arises in these things, which are in fact light, sound, and word. Okay, so Aquinas told us here that there can be two different forms of conscience, what I would call somewhat of a holy conscience, and the other one just a human conscience. And then where does it happen in the human being? Well, let's think for that a second. What happens when you are embarrassed, when you are ashamed, when you instantaneously feel regret? Your body blushes, doesn't it? In other words, something in your heart tells your heart to speed up and send blood out to the periphery of your body, and you blush uncontrollably, right? Except for people who don't blush because they don't have a conscience. Think of that. There are people who couldn't blush if they had to. They probably haven't had dreams either, and they probably don't have a very variable heart rate, which is the sign of a healthy person. And so you can look at the heart and you can say that the heart, as it's perceiving things, has many times a moral response to it that can cause you to go into instantaneous rage, not rage hopefully, but wrath, to feel wrath, not to go into rage, and I want to make that distinction. Divine wrath is that you wish that you had the action, just like lightning bolt, when they say, it's the God's truth, strike me with the lightning bolt if I'm lying. Well, that's what conscience is. It's lightning. It doesn't take a second for conscience to appear on your heart and say, that's right, that's wrong. Okay? Then you have to decide what you're going to do with it. Well, what is it that's going on with the heart that makes it a supersensible organ? Well, if you were to understand that, the easiest way, you'd go to our book on the human heart, which is now found as a PDF copy for free on our sites with our other books, and you can study that because we recently wrote a whole book on it, and it is the most amazing thing. The thing we said about the cerebellum, very little known, very little talked about. I've never heard an anthroposophist address that. Never once. Not once. And here, no one is going to address this either, but I'm going to tell you the secret, so I hope you're ready. Because you must be, because you're initiates, and you wouldn't be listening or you would have fallen asleep by now, right? That's the reason I talk in this voice, so that you'll go to sleep, and then your angel will hear what I'm saying and take it into your dreams. Now, that's a joke, but it's not a joke because that's what the anthroposophists used to always tell us. They'd give an hour and 45-minute lecture. If you went to sleep, they said, oh, all the better, because now your angel will be able to digest it for you. Well, no. Consciousness, first thing you have to have if you're going to be on a path of self-initiation. But if you're on a path of purity, you just listen to conscience. You don't even have to do any work. But if you're wrong, then you go the wrong way. You either go up or down, right? So here we go. What happens here? This is something I've been working on for quite some time, and only recently did I realize the reality, because only recently did they discover what it is that makes the heart beat. Now, the ancients said that there was a little thing about as big as your fingernail on your thumb, and that it was on, as Rudolf Steiner says, the surface of the heart. And yes, the sinoatrial node is right here, and it's on the surface of the heart. And the vagus nerve, which comes up from the body and the intestines and all organs, every organ reports to the vagus nerve. It comes through this point. Well, the right hand, there's two, see, I do two. The right hand one comes through here. This left hand one comes through one lower. This is in the atrium, and then in the ventricle, the left one goes through that. And this is something that is called the Ida, Pingala, and Sushumna in ancient teachings. And this is also called the Rui tree, or the Sintamani tree, or what Rudolf Steiner calls the frontal spinal column. Now, he points out that the frontal spinal column, with our development for initiation, goes from the heart into the pineal gland. But there's still that the vagus goes below, and the vagus reports to the heart. Everything happening in your intestines, everything except for basically your genitalia, everything else in the lower part of your body, all comes into the vagus nerve. It comes up and goes through the right-hand side, goes through the sinoatrial node. So Ida, Pingala, and Sushumna is the middle. And this is the parasympathetic nervous system. In other words, everything below your heart, you don't tell it what to do. It does it. And who controls it? Spiritual beings. And they do it for you. It's very simple. Like even your gut is run by a bunch of fantastic microbes that we don't even know what they are. You can't digest things without enzymes, and a human has yet to figure out what an enzyme is. We can work with its effects, but we don't know what it is. An enzyme is eternal if it's in a biological condition. It's eternal, it never dies. And it can do as much as 1 trillion reactions in 1 second without losing any energy. Okay, what are we describing here? We're describing the spirit. So when I'm talking about the mechanisms, I am not talking about the spirit. Totally two different things. The spirit makes the form doesn't make the spirit. And the function makes the form, and then the form creates the ability for us to use that either as a gift from the gods or for us to take over those gifts and start to do it ourselves. On the surface of the heart, if we were to be able to control that, we would actually be able to control what Rudolf Steiner calls, somewhere I thought I wrote it, moral technique, which means the ability to understand what your conscience tells you and to make the right action for everyone concerned, knowing what karma will come out of it will be good. That is what it's really all about. Can you do that? If you can, then you'll alleviate your suffering, you'll alleviate karma, and you'll be able to liberate everyone else around you. So that happens here. As we're reading the parasympathetic nerves, all the organs down here are parasympathetic. They're not sympathetic. We don't control them. The heart is turning into a sympathetic organ. Right now it's parasympathetic and partly sympathetic. When you blush and you're embarrassed, do you control it? No, but you do, but you don't. You don't control the mechanism, but the fact that it happened is something that you can control. Can you learn not to be ashamed and not to blush? Yes. Can you learn to deal with becoming shameless? Really is what it amounts to. As an initiate, you have to become shameless because you can't do anything that would create shame, because then your conscience wouldn't continue to evolve you into your higher self. So above the sinoatrial node, the vagus nerve goes up to just below, and I have it here, just below the cerebellum, which looks like a tree. And on top of the cerebellum is the corpus quadragemini, and on top of that is the pineal gland, and they say it looks like a flame. And when the aqueduct opens, it's usually laying down, it rises up and stands upright like a tree, like a flame, and they literally call it a flame. The singular flame, they call it, because it's the only ductless gland that's singular, right? And so this is sympathetic. So as the sympathetic reactions with the brain, at some point your brain can tell your sinoatrial node, hurry up, let's go. What happens when you start to run? What happens when you start to do exercise? What happens when you start to do something that you know you're going to really engage your willpower? What happens? well, this is what happens, but what happens generally is to say that it starts to speed up. Okay? So there's the sino-atrial node, then there's the atrial ventricle node, which slows down the heart. This is the pacemaker. And then below it is another one that will slow down the heart if your heart gets going too fast as an emergency. It will not, in general, it'll slow it down. Now, here's something that's really amazing. How is it that the sino-atrial node knows what speed the heart needs to be at as its pacemaker? That's because across this little tiny thing, this little thumb, they used to call it the flaming thumb in the ancient literature, the flaming thumb, which they say exists between the heart and the lung. It doesn't really. It exists in the heat that's coming from the lung and in the exchange with the blood going back and forth between the lung and the heart. But what it really is potassium, calcium, and sodium. When potassium channels are open, the heart speeds up. When calcium is open, it literally slows down to stop. It'll kill you. And if there's too much calcium. And when the sodium is too high, it slows it down. So when the kidneys, what controls the kidneys? Which here I have the word reins. Rudolf Steiner says kidney and reins, just like the Bible, and you'll see it in all the literature we put in the article. Kidney and reins are together. They work together. They work on the blood. The kidney controls the pressure of the blood. And what is it that it controls in the blood? Specifically, it cleans out minerals, salts, salt deposits, gets rid of the calcium, and it purifies the blood, right? In other words, it creates the pressure. Well, the pressure is also what would help create the flow, the warmth, all the action of the blood. So when you say with Rudolf Steiner, heart, sometimes he says heart and reins. That means heart and kidneys. In the Old Testament, they said your entire conscience, the knowing right and wrong, was all in your kidneys. But here, we know that they're a connected system. So if you can start to control yourself and listen to the voice of conscience, not only will you not blush so much or feel ashamed or regret or that you've done something wrong or that karma's going to come get you, because why? You have Steiner says this is a beautiful thing. He says, conscience is a presentiment of the horror or the happiness you're going to have when you get to the spiritual world after you die. Conscience can be a horror, or it can create great happiness. It depends on you and whether you wish to be moral or not. Same thing here. If you're immoral, no doubt, I'm sure that this would be true, though no one's done any research on it. Show a picture of something immoral, and I suggest to you that the parasympathetic nervous system will take over and your heart rate will go down. Show something they can do that's good and beautiful, and I suggest that the potassium channels will open and your heart rate will go up. It's as simple as that, folks. You control your heart rate by whether you believe you're being a moral being. And as you know, if you read our books on the heart, variable heart rate determines whether or not you're going to live a long and healthy life and what you'll die from. So this is all where it happens. If people want to think that it happens up there in the brain, well, I will admit that the cerebellum is a perfect part of the human being. And it's in a form that even looks similar to what it might in the future, which is all things will turn into spheres in the future, and the cerebellum looks somewhat like a sphere. And what is the heart? It looks like a sphere, and in the future it will change. And we've discussed what forms it will change into. But to say that this little teensy tiny thing right here, this, much less, actually it's much smaller than that, controls by sensing the balance between potassium and sodium, the entire bloodstream, the heartbeat, which controls how you feel. If your heart speeds up, you have no choice but to react accordingly. If your heartbeat slows down, or you have arrhythmia, or you have these problems with your heart, or any adjustment in the heart, it affects your consciousness. And what affects your heart? Conscience. If you have a clear conscience, Rudolf Steiner says, you'll be able to sleep at night. Now, John Barnwell points out that, well, that's until the modern times, when if you have no trouble sleeping at night, it may be because you don't have a conscience. And that's true. And it's absolutely true that we can stop this voice from sounding. We can increase the voice. We can learn the alphabet of the voice. And we talked about this last time. The alphabet of the spirit is the hierarchy, or the Aristotelian 10 categories. And so as you want to get into the spiritual world, you can do it the simple way by starting with conscience, or you can do it the long route, starting with consciousness and evolving it and beginning to understand all these things. Now, people look at this stuff and they go, you wrote too much stuff on the board. That's too much to cognize. I listen to your tapes over and over again, and I take notes because you talk too fast and you go over too much and there's too much on the board. That's all true. That's all true. And my producer, I don't know why she doesn't pull her hair out, because I do write too much and I do go too fast. But what do you expect me to do? I'm talking about a topic which the only way you can understand this is if you go into the Akashic records. You go into the Akashic Chronicles. You understand the Christian cosmology of Rudolf Steiner or some other spiritual scientist that is completely comprehensive, or else you can't get this. But if you do get it, then the thing you want, and that's who my ultimate producer, Tyler Gabriel, told me to do, talk to the initiates in the crowd. We have already done so many tapes on all the basics. We're talking about the subtle points here. And these points are points that I have been in anthroposophic meetings with the world leaders of anthroposophy, arguing these things with them. And many times they told me I was nuts and crazy until I quoted Rudolf Steiner back to them. You know, they'll tell me the conscious doesn't come from cherubim. And then I quote, Steiner says, what are you talking about right here? Steiner said it comes from the... And they go, what? Something comes from the cherubim besides lightning and thunder and harmony and love? And yes, conscience is like lightning striking. And the voice of conscience is like thunder. And where does thunder and lightning come? The lowest part of the cherubim and the seraphim, the beings of love, appear in thunder and lightning as a balance to our system. Now, the angels appear in the water, and the archangels appear in the air, and so on and so forth. So there's a mix of all of this happening. I'm not saying they're limited, but I'm saying that when you hear that voice of conscience, you are hearing a spiritual being speak to you from the realm of the cherubim. I know no anthroposopher that's ever said that besides Rudolf Steiner. And yet, that's what you need to know if you're going to understand that the entire mission of the human being, according to Rudolf Steiner, is to go from consciousness to conscience. And that's why this lesson is so profound, and you may have to listen to it a few times and take some notes and draw some pictures, do some mind mapping, whatever you do. That's why I draw a few pictures so you have an image and color, so that's the way the brain works, so that you can get a little bit. And I give you the scientific facts in case you say, that's a bunch of spiritual hoo-ha. That's just airy-fairy, and it's out in the ethers. Well, as you know, when you say ethers, I get scientific. I don't say ethers because I'm referring to something I can't explain, or I say, oh, that's so ethereal. No, we're going to talk about the exact ethers that manifest these things. The warmth ether is in your I am. It's in your blood. The light ether, it's in your astral body. It's called the Astral Light. And that's what you start with. Those are the lights that you see when you start your process of imagination, moral imagination, through initiation. With the sound ether, it penetrates into the etheric body. And Rudolf Steiner said that it is true, and it's nice that he corrects Aquinas. I love it when Steiner corrects Aquinas and Aristotle, and all of you who know what I'm talking about can have a laugh about that. But I love it when he corrects Aquinas and says something more than Aquinas has said. Well, it shows that evolution happens even for highly developed beings. So when we're talking about the habit of conscience over time, through your actions and your astral body, will imprint on the etheric body, and pretty soon, if you do that enough, you yourself, your etheric body will speak to you a kind of conscience that says, what is the compassionate, loving thing to do? And it goes right into your etheric body, and that is what is carried from life to life, folks. Your conscience leads you to the actions that are carried from life to life, that are imprinted in your etheric body, which is also where your memories are imprinted. But if we were to understand the true nature of the physical body, we'd understand the life ether. Now, mind you, when I say the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or the tree of life, they have fallen to the earth in sound ether and life ether, but those aren't the real sound ether and life ether. They're still above our atmosphere, coming from the sun. And those bring so much life that when we are able to finally experience the sun directly, it will give us all the nourishment that we need, both physically, emotionally, in our souls and in our spirit. And so when Rudolf Steiner says that the activity of conscience that imprints through repeated activity from the astral body into the etheric body actually becomes more than likely your spirit self. And it certainly adds to the body of Christ, because conscience is the moral fabric of love that is building the next world that we're going to live in. And it is directly a world that the being of Christ will be seen by everyone in it. So whether it's you have to start at the heart if you want conscience. You don't start in the head. If you do, just remember it's like this, and you have to remember that it's a choice you make. Okay? You can go one way or the other when conscience speaks, but it goes to the heart. And if you decide to listen to the voice of conscience, let us call it the holy voice of conscience, then you will know the right actions to take, and it will give you a better night's sleep. But then again, everything has a relative and an absolute answer. So when you say that, we debated long and hard. Rudolf Steiner also says that the initiate does not sleep at night for knowing of the suffering of the world. So, okay, if you have a good, clear conscience, you sleep clearly at night. If you don't, you wake up, you're bothered, so on and so forth. It's all relative or absolute. So when we're talking about these things, what I'm trying to do is show in the human body where the absolute enters into the relative, and where we can start. And we can start to claim these higher parts of ourselves that are there for us in the future, out of space and time. And they're there for us, and they're coming at us. They're coming towards us. As a matter of fact, Steiner says conscience comes, so willpower also comes streaming towards us, just like love does. Love is willpower, comes streaming towards us. And if we accept this, and we have compassion in our etheric body, then we're able to accept all that conscience has to give. And conscience is a voice that has many things to say, because there's always a moral perspective on everything. So, a few other things that are phrases, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. I recommend that you spend the rest of your life studying conscience, okay? Very simple. And next incarnation, we can continue this conversation, and still we'll be learning things. So, it says, many people call it inward divinity. So we're divine if we just listen to this voice. God on earth. That's what Navala says. He says that we are God on earth. We are the conscience acting through the human being is the willpower of God on earth. That's an amazing thing. Now, someday we won't have to be told what to do with the voice of conscience. We will know what to do, because we will have this presentiment of karma. It's also called divine light. I put that in there because, here it can appear as light or sound or the word. It doesn't just appear necessarily as a voice. And oftentimes it appears as a burning bush, a rushing wind, the sound of water, a loud waterfall, ball lightning. I love that when St. Jerome and many others had ball lightning come right into their room. I think it was Jerome who had his sister consumed by ball lightning, and then it left the room. I mean, so when we're talking about willpower, there is no end to how powerful life ether can actually be. It can give life, it can take life. And then it's called the living sign of the spiritual world, or that there is a spiritual world. Conscience, to some, is proof of the divine. Isn't that an amazing, simple thought? And to know that it sounds in us from the time we can understand speech, and even before then, it tells us not to do certain things. That's for sure. It's just like, they always say, why did God tell them not to eat the fruit? Why did he put it there to begin with? Well, that's conscience. It tells you what not to do. But at the same time, we had to follow that path so that we could develop to become co-creative beings. The superior voice, Emerson says there's a little guy in you and the big guy, and there's a battle between them, and sometimes you don't know who's on top and who's winning. And basically, in the end, hopefully you can decide which is the superior voice. I love that description. By the way, Emerson, Novalis, A.E., all these people, they say very little about conscience, except to give it the highest praise that words could possibly give it. And so they go superfluous on you. And you go, wait a second, these people don't get crazy with their words. Blavatsky doesn't get crazy with their words. Goethe doesn't get crazy with his words. They do when they speak about conscience, because it gets them all riled up. See how riled up I'm getting? My producers are telling me to calm down. I speak about conscience, and I get riled up. I see wrong, and I want to do right. You see? It should be natural. Okay, it's called our dignity as a human. Matter of fact, some people determine whether you're human by the actions you've taken, demonstrating whether you had conscience or not. It's called a drop flowing from God. Some people would even associate it with Amrita, Soma, and these other things, which often is associated with consciousness, but always has a moral component to it, because when it appears, when this drop flows from the heavens, it tells you what to do. It clears the way for you to take actions that will manifest without negative karmic consequences. That's what this drop flowing from God is all about. And then it's called the divine archetype of humanity. So when we talk about it, conscience, we're talking about the divine archetype. We can all reach that divine archetype. We all have it in us. And as you hear me say all the time, there's nothing in the cosmos that isn't in the human being. But unfortunately, in today's age, we have the possibility to ignore it. And that's how we get into the problems we're in. And if people would listen to their conscience, then we would not see the evil so rampant in our day. So study what it is to understand your conscience, to thoroughly thoroughly know the world. When you thoroughly know, then you are free to take actions that you are certain that love can act through in a positive way.